Steve Harvey had been hosting Family Feud for over 13 years, and in that time he had developed an ability to read people, to sense when a moment was about to become something more than just entertainment. But on a gray November afternoon in 2024, during what seemed like a routine fast money round, a 68-year-old Vietnam veteran named Sergeant Major Robert Bobby Sullivan was about to give an answer so profound, so unexpected, and so perfectly capturing the essence of what it means to serve, that it would cause Steve Harvey to do something he had never done in over a decade of hosting: stop mid-game, stand at attention, and salute a contestant on live television. What started as the final question in a fast money round would become a moment that defined the difference between patriotism as a word and patriotism as a lived reality, leaving an entire studio speechless and reminding millions of viewers what true service really means. Before we dive into this powerful story, make sure you hit that like button and subscribe so you never miss these moments that honor the extraordinary people who walk among us. The Sullivan family stood on the Family Feud stage with a quiet dignity that spoke of generations of military service. Sergeant Major Robert Sullivan, age 68, was a tall man despite the slight stoop that came from age and old injuries. His silver hair was cut in a military high and tight that he'd maintained for 50 years. His posture, even at 68, showed the discipline of a career soldier. Beside him stood his wife Margaret, age 67, whose eyes held both pride and the wariness of a woman who had spent decades waiting for her husband to come home from deployments. Their daughter, Amy, age 42, stood next to them along with Amy's husband, Tom, age 44, and their son, Robert Juder, age 19, who wore an Army ROTC uniform that suggested he was continuing the family tradition. They were competing against the Martinez family from Texas, and the game had been close, filled with good-natured competition and laughter. But there was something about Bobby Sullivan that had caught Steve Harvey's attention from the beginning. The way he stood, the way he answered questions with precision and clarity, the way his eyes would sometimes drift to somewhere distant before snapping back to the present. Steve recognized the look of someone who had seen combat, who carried memories that civilians couldn't understand. The Sullivan family had won the main game, and now they were in fast money. Amy had gone first and scored 164 points, meaning Bobby needed only 36 points to win the 20,000. It seemed like a sure thing. The family was already celebrating mentally, thinking about what they would do with the money. Steve walked over to Bobby with his microphone, his usual confident smile in place. "Sergeant Major Sullivan, your daughter did great. We need 36 points. That's very doable. You ready to bring this home for your family?" Bobby stood at attention, his military bearing automatic after so many years. "Yes, sir, Mr. Harvey. Ready to serve." Steve smiled at the military precision. "I like that. Ready to serve. All right, let's do this. 20 seconds on the clock. Here we go." The familiar fast money timer appeared on the screen. Steve began with the first question. "Name something people do to celebrate the 4th of July. Barbecue." Bobby answered without hesitation. "Name a reason someone might salute. Military respect." "Name something that flies. Birds." "Name a place where you stand in formation. Military parade." Steve paused before the fifth and final question. This was it, the last answer that would either secure the win or leave them short. Bobby stood perfectly still, his hands at his sides in a modified parade rest, his eyes focused but distant in the way that soldiers' eyes sometimes get when they're remembering things civilians can't see. "Name something." Steve read from his card, "that you would sacrifice for your country." It was an open-ended question, the kind that could have dozens of acceptable answers. Most people would say, time, or comfort, or maybe safety. The audience waited. Steve waited, the family waited, and Bobby Sullivan, this 68-year-old veteran who had served in Vietnam and carried 50 years of memories from that service, took a deep breath and gave an answer that stopped everything. "Everything," Bobby said quietly. "You sacrifice everything for your country." The studio went completely silent. Steve Harvey froze, his microphone still raised, his mouth slightly open. For several long seconds, nobody moved. The word, everything, hung in the air with a weight that transcended the game show context and became something profound. Steve slowly lowered his microphone. His face, usually so animated and expressive with humor, had gone completely serious. He looked at Bobby Sullivan with an intensity that suggested he was seeing not just a game show contestant, but a warrior, a man who had actually made the sacrifice he just named. "Say that again," Steve said quietly. "What did you just say?" Bobby's voice was steady, but his eyes had filled with tears. "Everything, Mr. Harvey. When you serve your country, you sacrifice everything. Your time, your safety, your comfort, your youth, your health, your peace of mind. You sacrifice holidays with your family. You sacrifice being there when your children are born, or when they take their first steps, or when they need you most. You sacrifice sleep, you sacrifice stability, you sacrifice the person you might have been if you hadn't served." His voice grew stronger, more passionate. "You sacrifice your friends who don't make it home. You sacrifice parts of your soul that you leave on battlefields thousands of miles away. You sacrifice the innocence of believing the world is a safe place. You sacrifice normalcy, because once you've seen combat, you're never quite normal again." Bobby looked directly at Steve, tears now streaming down his face, but his voice unwavering. "So when you ask me what I would sacrifice for my country, there's only one honest answer: everything. Because that's what service means. It means giving everything you have and everything you are, and accepting that it might not be enough, that you might die anyway, that your sacrifice might be forgotten anyway, but you do it because it's right, and because someone has to stand between the people you love and the darkness that wants to destroy them." Steve Harvey stood there, and for one of the rare times in his career, he was completely speechless. His eyes had filled with tears. His hand holding the microphone was trembling. The entire studio was crying, the audience, the crew, the other family, everyone. And then Steve Harvey did something unprecedented. He slowly, deliberately, set down his microphone. He straightened his posture, squared his shoulders, brought his hand up to his forehead in a crisp military salute, and held it there, standing at attention, honoring this veteran in a way that transcended television, entertainment, and everything else. The studio erupted. The audience leaped to their feet. The applause wasn't the usual game show celebration, it was something deeper, more reverential, a standing ovation for what Bobby Sullivan represented, and for what Steve Harvey's gesture acknowledged. Bobby, tears flowing freely now, returned the salute with military precision despite the emotion overwhelming him. The two men stood there, locked in this moment of mutual respect, Steve Harvey the entertainer and Bobby Sullivan the warrior, acknowledging something that went far beyond Family Feud. When Steve finally lowered his salute, he had to wipe his eyes before he could speak. His voice was rough with emotion. "Sergeant Major Sullivan, in all my years doing this show, I have never, and I mean never, heard an answer that moved me like that. We still need to reveal the board, but before we do, I need to say something." He turned to address the audience and cameras. "Y'all just heard a man answer a game show question, but what he really did was testify. He testified to what real service looks like. Not the flag-waving anthem, singing patriotism that's easy when it costs you nothing, but the kind of patriotism that costs you everything and you give it anyway." Steve looked back at Bobby. "Sir, thank you for your service. And I don't just mean thank you like it's something polite we say. I mean thank you for giving everything so people like me could stand on this stage and host game shows. Thank you for sacrificing everything so my children could grow up safe. Thank you for being willing to die so strangers could live." Margaret, Bobby's wife, spoke up, her voice shaking with emotion. "Mr. Harvey, Bobby isn't exaggerating when he says everything. We got married 2 weeks before he deployed to Vietnam. He was 19 years old. He came home 2 years later and he was a different person. The boy I married didn't come back. A man came back. A man who had seen things that gave him nightmares for decades." She continued, tears streaming down her face. "He missed the birth of our daughter because he was on his 3rd tour. He missed her first words, her first steps, her first day of school. He's missed birthdays, anniversaries, holidays. He's had surgery 12 times for injuries sustained in service. He has shrapnel still in his body from a mortar attack in 1971. He has PTSD that he's been managing for 50 years. He gave everything, just like he said." Amy, their daughter, added her voice. "I grew up with a father who was there physically, but sometimes absent mentally because he was trapped in memories of Vietnam. I grew up listening to him scream in his sleep from nightmares. I grew up watching my mother hold him when he broke down crying over friends who died in his arms 50 years ago. And you know what? He would do it all again. He would make the same sacrifice because that's who he is. Robert Jr., the grandson in his ROTC uniform, spoke with pride and emotion. Grandpa is my hero. He taught me that service means sacrifice. Real sacrifice, not just inconvenience. I'm joining the army because of him. Because he showed me what it means to be part of something bigger than yourself. And when he says everything, I understand now what that means. It means I might miss my own children's births. It means I might come home with injuries or trauma. It means I might not come home at all. And I'm willing to make that sacrifice because Grandpa showed me it's worth it. Steve was openly crying now, not even trying to hide it. Bobby, we haven't even revealed the board yet. We haven't seen if everything is up there. But I already know you won. You won before you even gave that answer because you've already given everything. The money, the game, none of that matters compared to what you've sacrificed. He turned to the producers. I don't care about protocol. I don't care about the format. We're taking a moment here because this matters more than any game show. Steve looked back at Bobby. I need to ask you something, and you don't have to answer if you don't want to. But when you gave that answer, when you said everything, what were you thinking about? What were you seeing in your mind? Bobby took a deep breath, his composure wavering. I was thinking about my brothers, Mr. Harvey, the men I served with in Vietnam who didn't make it home. I was thinking about my best friend, Corporal James Murphy, who was 20 years old when he died in my arms after stepping on a landmine. I was thinking about Private First Class Antonio Garcia, who was 18 years old when he took a bullet meant for me. I was thinking about the faces of young men who gave literally everything, their entire futures, their dreams, their lives, so that I could stand here today. His voice broke completely, and I was thinking about every military family who sacrificed everything too. The wives who raised children alone. The children who grew up without fathers or mothers. The parents who buried their children. The siblings who lost their best friends. Service doesn't just cost the person in uniform. It costs everyone who loves them. Bobby continued, the words pouring out like they had been held in for decades. People thank me for my service, and I appreciate it, I do, but most of them have no idea what that service cost. They see the uniform or the medals or the veteran status, but they don't see the nightmares. They don't see the anniversaries of battles where friends died. They don't see the inability to enjoy fireworks because they sound like mortars. They don't see the hypervigilance, the inability to ever truly relax, the constant scanning for threats that aren't there anymore. He looked at Steve with such intensity. When I said everything, I meant it literally. I gave my youth to Vietnam. I gave my innocence. I gave my peace of mind. I gave my ability to ever feel truly safe. I gave pieces of my soul that I'll never get back, and I did it willingly because my country asked, and because I believed then and I believe now that freedom isn't free, that someone has to pay the cost, and I was willing to be one of those someones. Steve Harvey had to sit down on the edge of the stage. He was overwhelmed, shaking with emotion, completely undone by Bobby's honesty and pain and courage. When he could finally speak, his voice was barely a whisper. We're going to reveal the board now, but I already know that whatever is up there doesn't matter because you've already taught everyone watching something more valuable than any prize money. You've taught us what real sacrifice looks like. He turned to the board. You said everything, for something you would sacrifice for your country. Let's see if it's up there. The board revealed the answers one by one. The first 4 answers Bobby had given were all on the board, solid answers that had accumulated points. Then came the 5th answer. Steve read it slowly. You said everything. He paused dramatically. Survey said. The board revealed the answer, and there it was, everything my life, listed as the number 2 answer with 23 points. The studio erupted again, but this time it was different. It wasn't celebration of winning a game. It was recognition that Bobby Sullivan's profound truth had been validated by the survey, that other people had understood what he understood about sacrifice. But Steve held up his hand for quiet. Bobby, you got 23 points for that answer, which brings your total to... He did the math quickly. 189 points. Your family total is 353 points. You crushed it. You won. The Sullivan family celebrated, hugging each other, crying together. But Steve wasn't done. Hold on, Steve said. Bobby, you won the 20 as a Sullivan, and your family earned that money. But I'm going to do something else. He pulled out his phone and made a call right there on stage. I need to speak to someone at the Wounded Warrior Project. Yes, right now. Tell them Steve Harvey is making a donation in honor of Sergeant Major Robert Sullivan, a $100,000 in his name to help veterans who gave everything. He hung up and looked at Bobby. You gave everything, and you said your brothers who died gave everything. This donation isn't enough. It could never be enough, but it's something. It's a way of saying that your sacrifice, their sacrifice, it matters. It's remembered. It's honored. Bobby was crying so hard he could barely stand. Margaret wrapped her arms around him, holding him up. Their daughter and grandson joined the embrace, and Steve Harvey stepped into it too. This unlikely group, united by shared emotion and recognition of sacrifice. Steve addressed the cameras one more time. If you're watching this and you're a veteran, I want you to know something. Your sacrifice matters. Whether you served in Vietnam like Bobby, or Iraq, or Afghanistan, or anywhere else, whether you saw combat or served in support roles, whether you came home with visible wounds or invisible ones, you gave something, maybe you gave everything, and that matters. He continued, his voice passionate and raw, and for everyone else watching, when you see a veteran, when you thank them for their service, I want you to really think about what that service cost. Think about what Bobby just told us. Think about the everything they sacrificed, and then ask yourself, what am I willing to sacrifice? What am I willing to give? Because freedom isn't free, and the price is paid by people like Bobby Sullivan and his brothers who didn't make it home. The taping was suspended. The game was over, but nobody wanted to leave. The audience wanted to meet Bobby, to shake his hand, to thank him personally. The crew wanted to hear more of his story. The other family, the Martinez family who had lost the game, came over to embrace the Sullivans and thank Bobby for his service. Over the next several hours, with cameras still rolling for what would become a special extended episode, Bobby shared more of his story. He talked about Vietnam, about the friends he lost, about the battles he fought, about coming home to a country that didn't want to hear about the war and didn't appreciate the sacrifices made. He talked about the decades of struggling with PTSD, of nightmares that still came 50 years later, of the way certain sounds or smells could transport him back to the jungle in an instant. He talked about the survivor's guilt of coming home when so many of his brothers didn't. He talked about the challenge of reintegrating into civilian life, of trying to be a husband and father while carrying the weight of trauma. But he also talked about the meaning he found in service, the bonds formed in combat that were stronger than anything else in life, the pride of having stood for something bigger than himself. He talked about the young men he served with, honoring their memories by speaking their names: James Murphy, Antonio Garcia, Robert Chen, Michael Washington, dozens of names of men who died in Vietnam and deserved to be remembered. Margaret shared what it was like being married to a combat veteran for nearly 50 years. People see Bobby now, and they see a 68-year-old retiree. They don't see the 19-year-old boy who went to war. They don't see the 21-year-old who came home with trauma he didn't have words to explain. They don't see the decades of nightmares, the hypervigilance, the struggles with PTSD before we even had that term. She continued, tears in her eyes, but they also don't see his strength, his integrity, his unwavering commitment to duty and honor. They don't see the man who has mentored young veterans, who volunteers at the VA hospital, who spends his retirement helping other veterans navigate the system and get the help they need. Bobby gave everything in Vietnam, and he's still giving, still serving, 50 years later. Amy talked about growing up as the daughter of a Vietnam veteran. Kids at school would say things about Vietnam, about how the veterans were baby killers or how the war was wrong. And I would go home and see my father, this honorable man who had nightmares about friends dying, and I knew they were wrong. My father went to Vietnam because his country asked him to. He served with honor, and he came home to a country that spit on him, literally spit on soldiers coming home. She wiped her tears. He gave everything, and for decades, he was treated like he was the problem. It's only in recent years that Vietnam veterans have started getting the recognition they deserve. My father is 68 years old, and he's finally seeing people understand what he sacrificed. That means everything to our family. Robert Jr., the grandson, spoke about his decision to join the army. People ask me why I would join the military when I've seen what it cost my grandfather. And the answer is simply because he showed me that some things are worth sacrificing for. He showed me that freedom isn't free, that our way of life is protected by people willing to give everything. I want to be one of those people. I want to continue the legacy he started. When the special episode finally aired 6 weeks later, the response was unprecedented. The clip of Bobby saying, "everything," and Steve saluting him went viral, viewed over 300 million times in the first month. News outlets picked up the story. Veterans organizations shared it widely. It became a cultural moment, a touchstone for conversations about sacrifice, service, and what we owe to those who serve. But perhaps the most powerful response came from veterans themselves. Thousands of them reached out to share their own stories, to say that Bobby had articulated what they had felt but couldn't express. Vietnam veterans in particular felt seen and validated, many of them saying it was the first time they felt their sacrifice had been truly acknowledged by mainstream culture. One Vietnam veteran wrote, "I've been home from Vietnam for 52 years, and in all that time, nobody has ever really understood what we gave." Bobby Sullivan said it perfectly: everything. We gave everything. And for most of those 52 years, the country we gave everything for didn't want to hear about it. Watching Steve Harvey salute Bobby, watching the audience stand and applaud, that healed something in me I didn't even know was still broken. Thank you. The episode also sparked a national conversation about how we treat veterans, particularly Vietnam veterans who had been welcomed home with hostility rather than gratitude. Organizations that supported Vietnam veterans saw unprecedented engagement and donations. The VA reported increased enrollment in mental health services as veterans who had been suffering in silence for decades finally felt safe to seek help. Steve Harvey reflected on the moment in subsequent interviews. When Bobby Sullivan said everything, I wasn't thinking about the game show anymore. I wasn't thinking about television or ratings or any of that. I was thinking about the fact that I was standing in front of a man who had given literally everything for people like me, and the only appropriate response was to salute him. It wasn't planned. It wasn't something I thought about. It was just the only right thing to do in that moment. He continued, and I hope that moment reminded people that we have veterans among us who made sacrifices we can't even imagine. They gave everything, and sometimes we forget that. Sometimes we take it for granted. Bobby Sullivan reminded us that we should never take it for granted. 6 months after the episode, Bobby Sullivan was invited to speak at the Vietnam Veterans Memorial in Washington, D.C. on Veterans Day. Thousands attended to hear this man who had become a voice for a generation of veterans whose sacrifices had been overlooked for too long. Bobby's speech was simple but powerful. 53 years ago, I was a 19-year-old kid who went to Vietnam because my country asked me to. I didn't go because I wanted to fight. I went because I believed in duty, in service, in standing up for something bigger than myself. I gave 2 years of my life to Vietnam, but in reality, I gave everything because the boy who went to war never came home. A different person came back. He continued, his voice strong despite the emotion, and I'm not special. Every veteran here, every person who has worn the uniform, we all gave something. Some gave their lives, some gave their health, some gave their peace of mind. We all gave, and for too long, that sacrifice wasn't acknowledged. But I want you to know that it matters. Your service matters. Your sacrifice matters. You matter. Bobby concluded, when Steve Harvey saluted me on Family Feud, he wasn't just saluting me. He was saluting all of you. He was acknowledging what we all gave, and I hope that moment helps people understand that when we say we gave everything, we mean it literally. We gave everything we had, everything we were, and everything we might have been. That's what service means. And it's time the country we gave everything for recognized that sacrifice. 1 year after the Family Feud appearance, Bobby Sullivan had become one of the most recognized advocates for Vietnam veterans in the country. He worked with legislators to improve VA services, spoke at military bases about the realities of combat and the importance of mental health, and mentored young veterans struggling with their own transitions back to civilian life. But when asked about his newfound fame, Bobby remained humble. "I didn't do anything special. I just answered a question honestly. I said everything, because that's the truth. That's what veterans give. And if my honesty helps people understand that truth, if it helps veterans feel seen and valued, then I'm grateful. But I'm not a hero. The heroes are the ones who didn't come home, the ones who gave the ultimate sacrifice. I'm just a guy who survived and is trying to make sure their sacrifice isn't forgotten." 5 years after that November afternoon, Bobby Sullivan was 73 years old and still advocating for veterans. The $20,000 from Family Feud had been donated to a scholarship fund for children of fallen service members. The attention from the show had been channeled into meaningful advocacy work. And the moment when Steve Harvey saluted him had become an enduring symbol of respect for veterans and recognition of their sacrifices. Steve Harvey and Bobby stayed in touch over the years, with Steve often calling Bobby for advice on how to support veterans or how to honor service members on his shows. Their unlikely friendship, forged in a moment of profound emotion on a game show stage, had evolved into a genuine bond based on mutual respect. In an interview marking the 5th anniversary of the episode, Steve reflected on why that moment had resonated so deeply. Bobby Sullivan didn't just answer a question, he spoke a truth that we all needed to hear. In a world where patriotism sometimes feels like empty words or political posturing, Bobby reminded us what real patriotism looks like. It looks like a 19-year-old kid going to war. It looks like sacrificing everything and then living with the consequences of that sacrifice for the rest of your life. It looks like continuing to serve even 50 years after you came home from the battlefield. He continued, and when he said everything, with such certainty, with such weight, I knew I was in the presence of something sacred. I knew I was hearing testimony from someone who had actually paid the price that most of us just talk about. The only response I had, the only response that felt adequate, was to salute him, to honor him the way he deserved to be honored. Bobby Sullivan passed away peacefully at age 76, surrounded by his family. His obituary noted his military service, his decades of advocacy for veterans, and the moment on Family Feud that had made him a symbol of sacrifice and service. But it also noted that he had lived to see his grandson, Robert Jr., become an Army officer, continuing the family tradition of service. At Bobby's funeral, Steve Harvey gave the eulogy. Through tears, he spoke about the man who had changed his understanding of sacrifice, who had taught him what it really meant to give everything for your country. He ended the eulogy by coming to attention and rendering a final salute to Sergeant Major Robert Sullivan, a warrior who had given everything and whose answer on a game show had reminded a nation of the true cost of freedom. So before you click away from this powerful story, take a moment to hit that like button and subscribe to this channel, because Bobby Sullivan's answer, everything, wasn't just a game show moment. It was a profound truth about what real service means. It was a reminder that while we casually use words like sacrifice and service, there are people among us who have lived those words, who have given literally everything and then spent the rest of their lives carrying the weight of that sacrifice. Steve Harvey's salute wasn't just good television, it was a recognition that some truths deserve to be honored, that some people have earned our deepest respect, and that sometimes the most important thing we can do is stop everything and acknowledge the extraordinary sacrifices made by ordinary people who chose to serve. Bobby Sullivan showed us that patriotism isn't about flags and anthems, it's about being willing to give everything for something bigger than yourself, and then living with the consequences of that choice for the rest of your life. That's not just an inspiring message, that's a call to remember, to honor, and to never take for granted the freedoms purchased by people who gave everything so we could have something.